Hello, Terry.
Hi, Tracy.
We have wanted to have this discussion for a really long time, and I'm glad the
I,
day is finally here.
I we started this discussion, we've been having this discussion on and off for like 5 years.
Yeah, yeah. So the discussion today is going to be about grief and how that affects creativity, quilting, your ability to sit down and sew.
Mhm.
And I think everyone has a little bit of a different experience. We saw this during lockdown, during COVID, where some people were incredibly creative and prolific and created these beautiful works of art, and other people were completely paralyzed.
Mhm.
Um, and so Terry and I decided that we would like to have a little conversation around this topic, and we've been talking about recording it for a really long time. We flip flopped. We thought maybe doing it live would be a great idea. But then we ultimately decided that sitting down together and having sort of a condensed version of this conversation
Mhm.
first, and then possibly opening it up to the rest of the team at Quilters Rule the World would be a really great idea, because I know they all have different experiences as well.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think I would like to bring this to the bigger group, partly because we all have had different experiences, and we have all had different experiences in terms of how we manage it. Um, and or how we don't manage it.
There's that too.
Right. So one of the things that really brought this up to the forefront this right now is that in a very short period of time in August, we learned of the deaths of Lori Harsh, Daniela Stout. Oh, there were
Carol Lyle Shaw, Freddie Moran. The list was about six different quilters,
right.
and
And the thing that kind of tripped it for me, like really kind of wanting to really have this discussion was I got a friend request from a quilter that I knew had passed away in January.
ooh, that's creepy.
It is a little creepy. You know, social media is a little weird. I'm sure we all get friend requests from creepy guys.
Yeah,
Delete block like immediately. But getting the one from this quilter that I knew, because I must have gotten another friend request from her earlier in the year, and it like within a couple of months of her passing, and I had actually looked her up for some reason and discovered that she had passed away. And you know, there you kind of sit there going, what the it, and then you kind of go, ooh, you know, and this is a quilter that I'd met. Um, Actually, Tracy, you knew her too.
yeah. I think we both met her at this. Well, maybe you knew her earlier, but I no,
It
we
was
both
at
met her at the
Bernina.
same thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It was at that event. So, there's grief from death, and that is a particular type of grief, and we grieve people differently depending on the closeness of relationship, right? I think the one that stunned us the most, I think, was Carol Lyles Shaw.
Yeah.
In part because I think, I don't want to reveal anything that shouldn't be public. So
Right,
it,
right. It was just
it
it was an unexpected loss. It wasn't
right,
like she was, much older and or had a disease that would have taken her.
right,
It was just very sudden. So
right. It was a very sudden loss, and we all know that happens. This particular period of time, it was just one person right after the other. And it was like some I knew personally, some I knew because they're our quilting mothers, and some like there was one person that was brought up in another Facebook post who was kind of in the quilting world, but in a very specific part of it. I'm like, oh wow, like There we go. One more.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
then
it
there's
sort of brought it to the forefront, and we'll put a full list of all of the quilters who passed during that period of time, just so that we don't leave anyone out.
right,
But it brought this conversation to the forefront for us because we know that we have several friends who are grieving heavily right now, and you and I have both gone through this.
right. And the discussion a number of years ago started about the how our work changes or things in our life can affect what we do or can't do as quilt makers.
Right.
Um, during during the pandemic, I know I've shared this part, I've shared the move and um how and I my husband and I moved to Texas, which has been delightful. Don't get me wrong. We moved to Texas right in the middle of COVID and lived in a hotel for a couple of months. There were some things that I did in the hotel, but for my sanity's sake, because the two of us in like a 15 by 20 room was was a lot. But since then, the creativity has kind of come and gone,
Mhm.
right? And I personally, with life circumstances, have uh, done essentially what I need to do. And even in then, it hasn't always been what I need fully to do.
Right. And I feel like it's been the same for me. It's been a requirement
Right,
I sew. It's been for work. Um, it's and then even then, I I wouldn't even be able to finish a quilt. I'd finish a top for a color option or something like that. And that was as far as it would go. And then it would go in, once I got it back a few months later, it would just go into like my UFO pile and I wouldn't finish it. And for me, I'm gonna delve a little bit and go a little more personal,
okay,
because for me it goes back to 2017. It was probably that year ended up as the worst year of my life. My sister passed away from cancer.
right.
It had been a really difficult few years before that. She had lost her husband 4 years prior, and he had a massive heart attack and died suddenly. And she went into a spiral and I couldn't help her, and she wouldn't let me help her in a lot of ways. And I think I'm sort of still coming to terms with that because for a long time afterward I had so much grief and guilt and so much pain after she passed. And that year was just particularly difficult, and I'll just sort of graze over it a little bit and say that I a business I was in, I had to leave. I lost a friend. I lost my sister,
Mhm.
um, and then got a new job that took me thousands of miles away from my family. I had been living, we had been living in a big house, and my oldest kid still lived at home, and I loved every minute of that. And I felt like my change forced everyone out of the nest, and so there was a certain amount of grief with that. And then I moved, and I feel like it needs to be said that um, that for a lot of people, moving your sewing space can cause a big turmoil in the space, which makes it really difficult to create sometimes. And while I was particularly organized because we were downsizing, moving into a two-bedroom apartment from a 3,000 square foot house, um, I had to be particularly organized about the supplies I kept, but they all weren't in one room anymore. They were in a closet under my bed. I had a list of everything that was under the bed so that they were, so I knew where things were. I had like armoires in different rooms that had sewing supplies. And while my space was right there, I had to keep it clean. I had to be particularly organized. I only sewed after that for specific things that I had to do. And
So
during the pandemic, I only made masks. I made like 125 masks, which was not a lot compared to a lot of people that I know. But still, that was all I could sew during the pandemic.
right. And I think during the pandemic, uh, um, so the there are places where I can be personal. There are places where I can't because there are people involved who don't want their story out. Um, it- the the year before the pandemic, I had been in a job that I ostensibly loved the job. I loved what I did, but there was an undercurrent of something. I think a good way for a good way to I got caught in a riptide.
Yeah.
And so, but I loved the job, but I kept getting dragged under in a way that I couldn't control it. And um, so, uh, it- so there were other things going on at the same time that caused us to move. And I think you made 125 masks. I made six.
Mhm.
Right. And not for nothing, I don't particularly feel guilty about that because most of my stuff for 2020 was living in a storage locker. So I was kind of, and I will say
We're
this too.
stuck.
Yeah, I was stuck. And there was a period of time where my own sewing machine, and I was so grateful to the dealer, but my own sewing machine was in for service because a motherboard had gone. Right. They loaned me another one for the duration. So I was very blessed during that, don't get me wrong. But it's still like, your own sewing machine has a feel, right?
Yes.
You
You're
know
used to it. You know your quarter inch, all that,
right,
you know.
right. And then there have been other things in the meantime that have just like I have ideas, and Tracy and I have talked about some of my ideas, right?
Mhm.
One of my, I have this, uh, two of my favorite quilts are Moon Over Manhattan and Twilight in the Bronx. Twilight in the Bronx was the first, Moon Over Manhattan was the second. And sitting right over there, I have a play on the two of those quilts that is in my head taking on other ideas. And it's sort of this amalgamation of a number of things, but it's still sitting right there waiting for me.
Looking at you.
Yeah, Tracy, it's mocking me at this point. And there have been other times, um, it, right, there have been other times where, with again, with some things going on in the background in my personal life, um, that have stopped me from quilting. And I remember the one year I was working at the City Quilter, so I was commuting into Manhattan, which was like an hour and a half to 2 hours each way. I had no, like, at this point, I had no choice about this. And the only time I had to sew was like Sunday afternoon. And there was one quilt that I did that year that I eventually gave to Alex Anderson. It was a tribute quilt to Yvonne Porcella. But that was the only quilting that I did for months. For months.
Yeah.
And uh, during that time, a mutual friend's husband passed away, and I gathered all the blocks from like all over and ended up making her two quilts. Um, but in the middle of my grief, I was having a hard time the middle when you're exhausted,
Yeah.
right? Which is something that I will say this, exhaustion is something that comes as a part of grief. Like your body is physically run down and sleep can sometimes be elusive. And so your ability to think through an idea is greatly diminished. Like, and it even to the point where like you're looking at a pattern, you understand all of the words, but being able to execute it
You're
sometimes,
not getting they're not soaking in your brain at all.
right?
Yeah.
Totally not.
Right.
A- And this feeling of being weighted down with the thing that you like there were weeks that I would go into my sewing room, like on the days that I had to sew, and even now, sometimes I come in here and I'm like, I'm doing some things, right? We've been recording and editing and whatever,
Right.
but I come in here to sew and I look around the room and yeah, no, peace out, bye.
I totally understand that. At this point, I'm bogged down by so many UFOs
Right.
that I walk into my sewing room and I don't know where to start. I don't know where to start at all. And I will say that after the pandemic, I talked about this on the Quilt and Tell podcast because we
Okay.
were at one point doing weekly podcasts just during the height of lockdown and making sure that, people had something to listen to and entertain them.
Right.
And what I ended up doing was making a quilt for my neighbor who had a baby during lockdown. And I didn't know what to do. Like I knew she was pregnant, all right? The baby was coming and before I knew it, the baby was like arriving. And um I ended up taking a layer cake, just making half square triangles with it, like big oversized half square triangles, creating a pattern, doing some straight line quilting on it, and that was it. And when I gave it to them, you would have thought that I had made an heirloom. And to me, I made them a basic baby quilt that, was going to get pooped on and spit up on and on laying on the floor for tummy time. And that was in my mind what I made. But the act of finishing helped me so much. I
Mm,
just needed to finish something for once. And it helped me sort of get over a little bit of a hump.
hmm At the beginning of 2021, I became a handy quilter brand ambassador. And I had a few finishes that year. I was learning the long arm, and I love that I will say this, I love that I can go back and forth. But it was around that time where some more of the personal stuff was really starting to hit. So I was doing just the bare minimum, right? But I will say this, I loved the learning process. It actually helped me deal with that some of that stuff. And I did finish a few quilts on the long arm, which I really enjoyed. And um my favorite though is I made this this just about king size orange quilt that has like a bajillion different things on it, including Bilbo Baggins at one point starts singing "The road goes on," or ever on and on. And so I have part of that quote stitched into the quilt. And one of the things that I think we've kind of come to as we've talked about this is that grief, to some degree, grief is simply part of life, and it can really affect how we're able to enter into that creative space. Some people during lockdown got really creative,
Yeah.
and for some of us, it just shut us down.
Right.
It and you and I had both been teetering on being shut down creatively
Already.
anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was sort of the nail in the coffin, for really
Yeah.
a odd turn of words, but it it sucked the creativity out of me. And
Yep.
so I personally can't function. Like I can't be creative when there's that much going on.
Right.
When I just can't. As a person who has dealt with autoimmune issues and health issues over the years, I've always sort of had multiple projects in different stages so that no matter what, I could work on something. And that grief sort of sucked the remaining little bits of creativity out of my life.
Hmm.
I could do nothing. And so I think at this point in our conversation today, perhaps we can talk about like how we've dealt with that and how we're planning to deal with it, because I feel like it's an ongoing process, and it grief comes in ebbs and flows. You never know when it's going
Right.
to hit you. And And so it's, for me personally, my goal this year is to, or over this winter, let's say, because I really don't like doing like resolutions in January, but I do feel like this time of year is like an ideal time of year because it's everything changes, the weather changes, and it's back to school, and like people have this extra focus, right? And
Mhm.
so for me, my goal is to put together a list of my UFOs and
Mhm.
use one of my books that I've got. I've got multiple planners for tracking UFOs. You start using those and actually put in where things are so that I can just pick up a project and say, okay, I've got an hour to sew. I'm going to take that hour and I'm going to put a binding on this. Or I'm going to take, I have 3 hours to sew. Maybe I'll work on quilting this quilt or putting this sandwich together, the quilt sandwich together. Another really great tip that I remember someone wrote in, oh, I know who it was. It was Aline Terrio. She's an amazing quilter in Canada. And she wrote an article for me in Quiltmaker magazine years ago about how a group that she belonged to handled UFOs. And this one woman used recipe cards in a little tin that had the quilt, and whenever she worked on it, she would take the card out and she would write down what she had done and what was left to do, so that she always knew, like she didn't have to pull it out of the bag and go, oh gosh, because the simpler we can make picking up a project, the better.
On my end of things, I'm still at the I have to do, I'm doing some have to do stuff. And some of it is a little like I'm preparing for a class. And uh, sometimes one of the things that I have found is even if I may never use it, doing simple sewing,
Mhm.
right? So yesterday I have a stack of 5-inch squares from uh, I was very picky about how I chose them.
Which is another part of creativity.
Right. Now, so I do simple sewing, or I do like wackadoodle sewing. I do simple piecing. Now, if you know me at all, my go-to is I take a piece of fabric and quilt the daylights out of it. Like
Yes,
that is
right.
great. That
That's
is
your
that
MO.
is what I do. That is who I am. And so yesterday, I know the act of simple piecing sometimes is that it's not so much the spark, but it's just that little bit of a wind in room that kind of gets the flame going again. And so I did this simple sewing, and after we're done talking today, everything's going to get trimmed up, and then I'll do a little bit more simple sewing and some very simple quilting, partly because I have a class that I'm teaching tomorrow, and but also, right, I need to do some prep work. So there's some prep work that needs to be done for the class. So that'll be done. But then I'm working on another project that like is just beautiful. It really is just beautiful. And it is amazing to me sometimes how utterly stunning like color on color quilting can end up being. And so sometimes those simple things, going back to those things that like, oh, you fell in love with, and it's become just part of your quilterly, the very, like the very basic part of your own quilterliness, and doing those things, right? And so that is in part how I am managing this. Part of it, Tracy, there is a pile that I am look that people I'm not going to show you. But there's a
Doesn't
stack of
like you
things that
that much.
no, there's this trait. I'll send you a picture later. There's an idea stack piling up in front of my fabric stash that I think it's time for me to kind of put in put in places, put in make little spaces that I can just put the projects in.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I love to use like an iris scrapbooking bin for
Yeah,
projects. Um,
I love
I
those.
don't want to use too many of those. And I actually found these little plastic bins that are open on the top at in the Target dollar bin right
Mhm.
before back to school. And I bought 4 of them. And they are now sitting next to my sewing machine, and they have the projects that I want to work on next. Those are newer projects or things that have been on like the back burner for a while that are ready for me when I'm ready to work on those. So beyond, like, I think the way that I want to tackle it, because I've got like 25 tops that need quilting or need like just one more thing, like just a few more blocks, or the blocks need to be sewn together. Um, and and so I have a plan in place at least. I've got someone to quilt them for me, or I'm gonna quilt them myself. And in between those projects, I think if I want to start something new, they're right there waiting for me. The ones that I know I really am like excited about.
Well, and one of the things that has actually fed my creativity over the last few years is buying fabric. I know that I'm a quilter, we buy fabric. Sometimes that is the most creative thing we can do
Absolutely.
because it's color, or it's something, it's a pattern that excites us. Um, just outside of the screen here, one of my favorite fabric designers is Jeannie Summerall Harrell, and so I have one. I love her. I love her stuff. I love Jeannie, but I have one of her panels up here now, and I actually found another one the other day. I'm like, ooh, I could do that for another project. I'm like, I'm not doing that for that particular project, but that I even had like the big idea, right? To even take that to that project, it was fabulous. I'm gonna go. I realized yesterday I'm gonna go in a. I thought I was gonna do one thing, but I'm gonna do something else. So like for me right now, being slightly task oriented, like I have tasks that must get done in a timely manner. It Sometimes you have to prime the pump. So buying fabric, buying thread over the last few years is it means that I haven't lost that sense of creativity. I just don't know how to use it right now.
Right. Sometimes cutting fabric is all you can do. Pulling fabric for a project, even if you're not going to actually make that project,
Right.
sometimes is enough to sort of get the creative juices flowing.
Right. One other thing I did too, we have a mutual friend, Latifa Safir. I bought her ruler and a couple of her patterns,
Mhm.
and I have like a big idea for it. And then I realized it didn't have quite enough fabric, but I'm sitting here going, wait a minute. If I'm looking at doing this, it doesn't necessarily need to be this. So I want to do one of her quilts kind of in solid colors. It doesn't need to be all the same fabric, right?
No, I mean, it's not going into a magazine. So,
No, but I'll tell you too this morning, uh, making 4 patches, which is like, it is not exciting sewing, but there is something kind of cathartic to it.
I'm telling you, that's what I've been doing the past few weeks. Like I have this UFO that is my oldest UFO. If it were up to me, that would have been in the garbage or at the Goodwill long ago.
Right.
But my husband is determined that I make that quilt. And it is all 2.5 inch squares and 2.5 inch half square triangles. It is, what is it? It's like a sunshine and shadows box. So it's like, got 2 half square triangles on either end, and otherwise it's a 9 patch, right? It has just been a thorn in my side for years because I have tried sewing it so many different ways over the years, and I just can't do it. So I just put a stack of those dang squares right in a little basket next to my sewing machine, and it has been my leader and ender.
Oh, and those are a
Just
great
going.
size for leader enders,
It
right?
really is. And so now I've got a bunch of twosies, and I've been putting them together into 4 patches. And that's the way I'm doing it. That is just the way I'm doing it. That's the way it's going to get done. I'm hoping to get it done by Christmas. Don't tell him.
I will not hold you to that.
But I'm also driven by deadlines. And so giving myself a deadline is helpful.
Right. And I that the deadline piece sometimes it really does help that because even if you're not doing the most what you personally would consider the most creative thing, you're
Mhm.
still kind of feeding that creativity. The other thing that I did for a while and may or may not go back to is I was exercising every day for a while. I got really discouraged because even though I'd been exercising for well over a year at one point, like a- at least for the most part, except when I had a sinus infection, um, I was not losing any weight
You
at all.
plateaued. We can call it what it is. You
Oh,
plateaued.
no, I actually started gaining weight again, even though I was exercising. It was very frustrating, Tracy.
Yeah. I was there. I remember,
Yeah.
you know.
Uh, but you know what? I can still go for a walk. I can still go sit in my backyard. I have a hammock. And sometimes just staring at I need to be careful in my backyard because it's on the southwest side of the house. So, if I go out in the afternoon and Texas has so many dang bugs.
It's the South, but we were talking about this week. We're both in the South now, and it's like, dang, there's so many bugs here.
And a few weeks ago, I had a lizard in the house. And I, I it makes me laugh now because I stopped cold. I looked at it. I'm like, what the hell do I do with this? Okay. It, be that as it may. Yesterday, while I was doing this practical sewing for a class that I'm teaching tomorrow, um, which is kind of hilarious when you think about it, I I wanted to make some rather large half square triangle units because I was just piecing a whole bunch of stuff together like just because it was sitting there. I'm like, all right, if I use this, great. If I don't, that's fine too. So I took the 5-inch square because they're like 5-inch widths. They were a layer. I just realized they were a layer cake. Um, so I had these 10-inch squares that were cut in half because I was using it for a project for you actually. And I think it was my favorite quilt that I did for you. No, it wasn't that one. I had by way of
Very
explanation.
has creative brain. It just hit.
Yeah. And so I actually took the 5-inch cardboard
Mhm.
and lined it point to point along one edge of the fabric and used the long edge then as my guide to stitch my diagonal line in.
Oh, that's smart.
It worked. So I positioned it just so that the inside edge of the foot was resting on that piece of cardboard. And so my foot was the needle was at the 1/4 of an inch mark.
Yes.
And I just stitched. When I got to the end of the cardboard, it was like maybe an inch and a half more that I had to go. So I just kind of went for it. If it's not perfect, but that's not the point.
The point is to just sew, to just do it, right?
Right. Yeah. And so like as I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, oh, I could do this. Which would actually be kind of a delightful play on something. And before we got on, I was pressing fabric. I have a stack of stripes over there that I'm gonna use for part of this. I don't know what yet, but there doesn't matter. Um, so creative brain. And then this is what happens when creative brain starts going. Creative brain has been very active recently, which often means that the sewing and quilting part is coming. So
I agree. I agree. I feel like I've been staggered a little bit because I've moved, had to
right.
set up a new space. the space is a little bit small and I have a bunch of stuff, you know, it's smaller than my last place. And um and so I needed to get everything in an organized fashion enough for me to be able to like sit down and sew and be able to think.
Right.
And it finally happened. We had guests coming, so I kind of had to like zhuzh it up a little bit, and that got me enough going. And then I was paralyzed by what do I start with? And I think that's like the biggest problem that I run into is like, what do I want to make? What do I want to do? And that guilt of like other projects that are sitting there bothers me. But
Yeah. Well,
so
you also touched on something too that really, when you do a big move, like you're moving, when you have to move your entire sewing studio from one place to another, and I don't care if it's across town or cross country, and you've done two cross country moves essentially, and I've done a cross country move, um, into a new room, right? It takes a little while to get this space set up so that you're comfortable with it, right? And I have my sewing room in New York was smaller than this one, but it had more window. And I realized at some point that's one of the things that I'm missing. And then I realized recently that I'm not sure because of I am right under our attic. We have a floor and a half. We have a house and a half. Um, I'm right under the attic space where things like the water, like there are things up there that part of the air handling unit is up there and whatever else. So there's things up there that necessitate just having a window in here. And I talked to my sweetie about switching rooms so I could have more light. And he's like, we can just do different lighting in your room. I'm like, that's not
I get that. Yeah, I
what
get
I do.
that.
So
I
probably
just
on both.
realized that I really liked having my sewing machine next to a window because one, you have better lighting, but two, I liked being able to see outside. I liked being able to see people walk by,
Yeah.
you know, or see wildlife outside, birds and animals.
In New York, I could see the sunset. And we had some beautiful sunsets. Here I tend more to see the sunrise, but I could see the sunsets. Um, but uh, like I would really have to open the whole window up. Um, and now I do filming here, which is not something I was doing in New York. And so you have like,
So too.
right, and you have to set up your space in such a way that it's conducive to filming, which is not necessarily always conducive to
Doesn't have
sewing.
anything to do with the conducive to sewing. Zero things. So
No, no.
that just even touches on like professional being professional quilter changes everything as well. It's
Yeah,
different from a hobby. That's why
right.
we have so many deadlines. And so while a normal quilter might not have a deadline, or the deadline might be a wedding or a baby, you know, or a graduation or some birthday or whatever, right? That's a different kind of deadline than, oh my God, I have to finish this because it needs to be photographed, but for the magazine or whatever, you
Or
know?
it's going to hang at market.
Right. Oh God. Yeah. And you only have a few weeks to do it, which, you know, is a whole nother conversation about like what it's like to be a professional in this industry and how that sort of changes your ability to sew. But I feel like we've at least touched on
Hmm.
the important basics of this conversation that you and I have been sort of having behind the scenes. And let me tell you, it's been years, and the two of us going, oh wait, we should really just save that for when we film, you know, like it's been years of that. Um, so
And I,
I'm looking forward to opening this up
yeah,
to,
and I think this is actually it in another regard. I think this is actually a good time because we're still being affected by uh 2020, 2021, and how things have, we're still unfolding from that. We don't know, like there are still things,
Recovering,
right?
all
And,
recovering.
and we're both discovering in very different ways that the business side of things is changing, and there's an uncertainty as to where that's going,
Right.
right? Which is fine, which is fine. We're still on that journey of discovery. Just like grief is a journey, quilt life is a journey, and it takes you where it's going to take you. And but I will say this. I'm glad that we're having this talk. I'm glad we're going to bring it to the larger group because I think that is wildly important.
I think that they all have different perspectives of how grief and how different things that have happened to them has affected their creativity.
Right,
And it's important for everyone to understand that this happens and that it's okay.
right.
At the end of the world. We don't take your quilting card because you haven't sewn in months,
Or years.
right? For some
Right.
people, it is years.
Yeah.
So,
And quilting is a gift, it's a creative gift. And sometimes we need to step back from it to take care of whatever is going on in the background. And even if it's on the business side of things, sometimes we just need to step back.
yeah,
And that too is okay. Partly because sometimes we just need to step back and, I think the quilting world is like a Monet or a Manet painting. When you're stepping back from them, you get the whole vision. But most of the time, we're like right up close,
we're
and
up
all we can see
close.
is,
Right,
yeah, all we can see is the mess.
right.
So, thanks, Tracy, for having this conversation. And friends, please stay tuned in a minute or so because we have a blooper.
Indeed, we do have a blooper.
And now it's starting back up again. So we'll
Well,
give you a clue.
it'll be your treat for staying tuned all this time for this, complicated subject.
Yes. And so stay tuned for our next episode, and then watch a little later in our series of episodes of Quilters Rule the World for a group discussion on all of this. And thank you for joining us. You are Quilters, you are an utter delight, and you actually inspire us and actually keep us quilting sometimes when it's very hard.
Very, very true. Have a good
Thanks.
Do you have something to add to this conversation on grief? Please leave a comment below.
I'm drinking coffee.
I'm drinking water. Did I ever show you this?
Oh,
Some
mine is the
people,
bouncy what?
some people say their body is a temple. Mine is a bouncy castle.
It seems kind of dirty.
Um, it's why I don't run in public. We're keeping this in. Or I'll pull it for like
a reel at the end. For those who choose to stay until the very end, they get the blooper reel. That would be hilarious. That's actually a good idea.